politicians are picking their voters instead of the other way around, and a brand new Supreme Court ruling just rewrote the rules of the game.
Yeah, it is. It's basically the ultimate invisible battleground where the map itself is pulling the strings long before anyone actually casts a ballot.
Right. So today is April 29, 2026, and we are taking a deep dive into this because the U.S. Supreme Court just handed down a massive decision in a case called Louisiana v. Calais.
Huge decision.
Yeah, it completely rewrites how race and politics intersect when we draw voting lines in this country. So we're going to be looking at the actual court opinion today, some fascinating academic modeling by Thomas P. Towsey, election simulations, and reporting from Punchbowl News and The Guardian.
We're basically trying to figure out how human geography has effectively become electoral destiny, right?
Exactly. And this Supreme Court ruling is dropping directly into the middle of a chaotic nationwide mid-decade redistricting war that started, well, back in 2025, right? State legislatures across the country have just been rapidly redrawing their congressional maps ahead of the midterms. It's an absolute frenzy of shifting boundaries out there.
But right off the bat, before we get into the actual mechanics of these maps, I need to give you a quick note. Because we are looking at highly charged political actions from both Democrats and Republicans, along with major court decisions. We are not taking any sides today.
Right, definitely not.
Our mission is purely to report the facts from these sources and explain the underlying machinery of what is happening. We're just looking at the math, the geography, and the law.
The focus is entirely on how the system operates, how district lines dictate voting power, and how this current nationwide map war might actually end up as, a massive tie.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's jump straight into that mid-decade redistricting war, because you really need to understand this political arms race to grasp why today's Supreme Court ruling is such an earthquake.
Yeah. You need the context. Normally, states redraw their congressional maps every 10 years,
Yeah.
right after the federal census. Right. They get the new population numbers, they adjust the lines, and that map is supposed to sit locked in for a decade.
Supposed to, yeah. But starting in 2025, former President Donald Trump launched a massive pressure campaign targeting Republican-led state legislatures.
And the explicit goal there was to crack open those existing maps and redraw them mid-decade, right?
Yeah.
To protect a razor-thin Republican majority in the House.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because Constitution mandates redistricting every 10 years, but there's actually no explicit federal law stating you cannot redraw the lines a second or third time in the middle of a decade.
Wow, really?
Sort of a loophole. And Texas fired the first major shot in this battle. They rammed through a heavily gerrymandered map designed specifically to gain 5 new Republican seats.
Texas is a lot.
It is. And they didn't just tweak the lines. They fundamentally carved up suburban districts that were trending purple and merged them with deep red rural areas to dilute the opposing vote.
Right, and then Missouri and North Carolina quickly followed that playbook, right? Redrawing their lines to net 1 additional Republican seat in each state.
Yep. But when one side launches an aggressive maneuver like that...
Retaliation is basically guaranteed.
Oh, absolutely. Democratic-led states immediately struck back.
Yeah.
And the mechanisms they used to do it were just wild.
Yeah, California was the first to retaliate. And what's fascinating about California is that voters there previously established an independent redistricting commission.
Right, specifically to stop this kind of thing.
Exactly. That commission was designed to strip map drawing power away from partisan lawmakers to prevent gerrymandering. But the Democratic legislature found a way around it.
How did they do that?
They essentially appealed directly to the public by placing Proposition 50 on the ballot. It asked voters to temporarily bypass the independent commission's authority just for this election cycle.
Wow.
And the voters actually passed it. So the legislature took control of the pen, drew a new map, netting 5 Democratic seats, completely offsetting the Texas gains.
And Virginia acted right on their heels. Virginia voters just passed an amendment to their own state constitution that allowed the legislature to redraw the lines, netting Democrats 4 additional seats.
The national political pressure driving all of this was incredibly fierce. Trump was openly threatening to back primary challengers against any state-level Republican who refused to support aggressive mid-decade maps.
Right. There were even intense reports of state lawmakers facing swatting incidents and severe harassment at their homes.
Which makes the situation in Indiana so completely unexpected.
Oh, yeah. That was a huge surprise.
With all of that national pressure bearing down on them, the Republican-led Senate in Indiana actually stood up and killed the redistricting push.
They crushed the legislation with a 19-31 vote on the state Senate floor. By voting down their own party's mandate, Those Indiana Republicans ended up saving 2 Democratic seats in their state.
Wait, why would they do that?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the mechanics behind that Indiana vote reveal a lot about the reality of local governing. Redrawing maps mid-decade is incredibly risky for incumbent politicians, regardless of their party.
Because they get new voters, right?
Exactly. If you change the boundaries of a district, a state senator or representative suddenly inherits a massive chunk of new constituents who have never voted for them, whose local issues they might not understand.
And who might challenge them in a primary.
Right. The Indiana legislators ultimately chose self-preservation and local stability over the national party's demands for a larger congressional majority.
So let's look at the scoreboard after all of this chaos. Texas adds 5, California adds 5, Virginia adds 4, North Carolina and Missouri add 1 each.
It's just a nationwide arms race.
Right. Both sides spent massive amounts of political capital, dragged their states through chaotic legislative battles, and faced endless lawsuits, only to arrive at what the sources are calling a net wash.
Yeah, the sheer aggression of this tit-for-tat really eroded voter trust across the board. Now, some lawmakers are actually on the record saying they deeply regret starting the fight because the math yielded almost zero actual advantage for either side.
So this entire nationwide war just backfired on the politicians who started it.
Basically, yes. The entire mid-decade map war ended in a stalemate. But while states like Texas and California engaged in all-out partisan warfare, Ohio offers a very different, very stark lesson in how political leverage actually dictates map drawing when politicians are forced into a corner.
Right. Let's talk about Ohio. Their Redistricting Commission just passed a bipartisan map with unanimous support from both Republicans and Democrats.
On the surface, that sounds like a massive victory for functional government.
It does. But the map they universally agreed on strengthens the GOP's likelihood of winning 12 of the state's 15 congressional seats. That's a +2 advantage for the Republicans.
And Democratic leaders actually voted in favor of this map.
Yeah, they openly called it the best of a worst-case scenario.
The underlying leverage here is what forced their hand. The Republicans in the Ohio legislature held a supermajority. They walked into the negotiating room and made a very clear threat.
They were prepared to unilaterally pass a heavily skewed 13-2 map.
Exactly. Because they had the votes to override any opposition, they didn't need a single Democratic signature to make that map a reality.
So the Democrats looked at the board and realized their only option was to accept the 12-3 map to guarantee their party at least 3 seats, rather than risk walking away with only 2.
They bargained from a position of absolute weakness.
But hold on, wait. A 12-3 map for Republicans in Ohio. That math simply doesn't track with reality. Ohio is a deeply divided, competitive state.
Right. It leans Republican, but it's not.
It is nowhere close to an 80-20 state. So how does a map naturally get skewed to 12-3 even before the backroom threats and intentional gerrymandering start happening?
Well, you've hit on the core mechanical problem of American elections here. The answer is that politicians often don't even have to rig the maps because voters are accidentally doing the work for them.
Really? How so?
Human geography plays a massive structural role in how elections are decided, often long before a politician ever touches a mapping software.
Okay, this brings us perfectly to the academic concept from Thomas P. Towsey's thesis that we pulled for this deep dive.
Yes, his work is fascinating.
Towsey studies why the physical places we choose to live naturally skew our elections. He calls this phenomenon unintentional gerrymandering, or, self-gerrymandering.
Because we always picture map makers sitting in a dark, smoke-filled room, maliciously drawing crazy, squiggly lines that look like a Rorschach test just to cheat the system.
Right. But Towsey points out that unintentional gerrymandering happens without any grand conspiracy at all. It simply happens because Democrats naturally cluster together in dense urban cities,
while Republicans are spread out much more efficiently across wide rural and suburban areas. The sheer density of urban centers creates a massive efficiency problem for the Democratic Party. Because Democratic voters live packed tightly together in city centers, they end up winning urban congressional districts by overwhelming margins.
Right. A Democratic candidate might win a district in downtown Chicago or Los Angeles with, 80% of the vote.
Meanwhile, a Republican candidate might win 3 surrounding suburban and rural districts with 55% of the vote.
And in our winner-take-all voting system, winning a district by 80% does not give you a louder voice or more power in Congress than winning by 51%.
A win is a win.
A win is a win. Every single vote cast beyond that 51% threshold is what political scientists classify as a wasted vote or an excess vote.
Because Democrats voluntarily pack themselves into cities, they generate millions of wasted votes across the country simply by choosing to live near each other.
The real-world statistics on this structural disadvantage are staggering. Take the 2012 election for the U.S. House of Representatives. In that election, Democratic candidates actually won a plurality of the national popular vote. They captured 48.5% of the vote nationwide, compared to the Republicans' 47.8%.
But because of this geographic sorting and the concentration of wasted votes in urban centers, the Republican Party secured a commanding 234 to 201 majority of the House seats.
Wow. So the party that received fewer total votes easily won control of the chamber.
Yeah. And to prove that this disconnect isn't solely caused by politicians intentionally rigging the lines, we can look at the computer simulations run by political scientist Zhu Chen.
Right. Chen wanted to see what would happen if you removed human bias entirely.
Exactly. He programmed a computer algorithm using election data from Florida in the year 2000. That was the famous Bush versus Gore election, where the state was effectively split 50-50 down the middle.
And he instructed the computer to draw thousands of completely random, non-partisan districts, right? The algorithm was strictly forbidden from looking at political data.
Yep, it was only allowed to draw compact shapes with equal populations.
And what happened?
Even in a perfectly tied state, using perfectly neutral, algorithmically generated maps, the computer inherently handed Republicans a 61% seat advantage.
Wait, purely by algorithm?
Purely by algorithm. The geography of the state simply dictated that outcome. The Democratic votes were too concentrated in places like Miami and Broward County to translate into proportional representation across a map of equally sized districts.
It's almost like pouring water into ice cube trays.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Imagine you hand both political parties a gallon of water. The Democrats take all their water and pour it into 3 massive giant ice cubes.
Right.
But the Republicans take their gallon and spread theirs out into a standard tray, making 10 perfectly sized little cubes. Both sides use the exact same amount of water, but one gets way more cubes.
That analogy perfectly illustrates vote efficiency. You cannot mathematically win 10 seats if you have concentrated all of your voters into 3 massive urban districts.
So do politicians exploit this natural sorting?
Oh, absolutely. Once map makers realize that the voters have already packed themselves into these geographical ice cubes, they intentionally weaponize it, using tactics called packing and cracking.
Right. They might intentionally pack as many of the opposing party's voters into one single urban district as mathematically possible, willingly conceding that one seat so they can easily sweep the surrounding 5 suburban seats.
Or they do the exact opposite. They crack a heavily populated city right down the middle, separating those urban voters and drowning them out inside 2 larger rural districts.
And that weaponization of human geography is exactly what brings us to today's massive news out of the Supreme Court. Because politicians know exactly where everyone lives, they use incredibly granular demographic data to draw these lines.
Right.
But today's ruling in Louisiana v. Calais fundamentally altered how lawmakers are allowed to look at race and politics when drawing those lines.
So the Supreme Court struck down Louisiana's congressional map today. That map contained a second majority black district, which the state legislature had drawn under pressure from previous court orders.
But today, the Supreme Court completely reversed course, calling that same map an unconstitutional racial gerrymander.
To understand the massive legal earthquake here, we really have to look at how the courts handle the 2 different types of gerrymandering, racial and partisan.
Historically, the Voting Rights Act has heavily protected minority voters from having their voting power intentionally diluted.
Right. If a state drew lines that systematically prevented black voters from electing a candidate of their choice, federal courts would step in and mandate a new, fair map.
But in a previous landmark case called Rucho, the Supreme Court ruled that partisan gerrymandering is completely legal and beyond the reach of federal courts.
Yeah, drawing lines specifically to favor Republicans over Democrats, or vice versa, is considered a standard political practice. Federal courts are not allowed to stop you from drawing a map purely for political advantage.
And the collision between those 2 legal realities is the defining problem of modern election law.
Because in the United States, race and political affiliation are incredibly tightly correlated.
Right, black voters, for example, overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party.
So when a map maker uses demographic data to crack a minority neighborhood, it becomes almost impossible to determine their true intent. Were they targeting those voters because they are black, which is an illegal racial gerrymander?
Or were they targeting those voters because they vote for Democrats, which is a perfectly legal partisan gerrymander?
Exactly. And that legal knot is what Justice Samuel Alito attempted to cut today with his majority opinion. Alito updated the famous Jingles framework.
Right, the Jingles test has been the gold standard legal framework used for decades to determine if a map violates the Voting Rights Act.
Well, Alito wrote a new, stringent rule into this test. Plaintiffs challenging a map must now completely disentangle race from politics.
The standard he just set is incredibly high.
It really is. Because partisan gerrymandering is a legally protected action under the Rucho decision, Alito argues that a map cannot be struck down for racial discrimination if the state can plausibly prove their primary goal was purely political.
So if map makers can demonstrate they drew the lines to protect a Republican incumbent or to secure a partisan advantage, the map is deemed legal, even if it has a devastating, disproportionate impact on minority voters.
Yes.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. So if a politician sits in a deposition and openly admits, I drew this line straight through the middle of this minority neighborhood specifically to hurt my opponent's party, that's perfectly legal.
Under this newly updated framework, yes. The federal courts will not intervene. This fundamentally shifts the entire burden of proof.
Wow.
Historically, courts looked heavily at the effect a map had on minority communities. If the voting power was demonstrably diluted, the map was highly vulnerable to being struck down. Now, voters challenging a map have to definitively prove the intent of the map maker was driven by racial animus and not just hard-nosed political strategy.
We have to look at the counter perspective here, though, because Justice Elena Kagan wrote a fierce dissent to this ruling.
She did. She argued that this decision essentially guts Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, rendering it completely toothless.
Because her dissent attacks the central premise of Alito's argument, right?
Exactly. Kagan points out that because race and partisan preference are so deeply intertwined in American voting behavior, it is essentially a mathematical impossibility to cleanly disentangle them.
She argues that this new framework gives state legislatures a free pass to continuously dilute minority voting strength, knowing full well that any smart mapmaker will simply cite partisan advantage as an impenetrable legal shield.
She literally wrote that this new standard makes proving a Voting Rights Act violation well-nigh impossible. Because what mapmaker is ever going to admit they looked at race?
Right. They will always just point to the voting records and say they were just trying to beat the Democrats.
This decision expands the boundaries of acceptable map drawing significantly. Maps that would have undoubtedly been struck down just a few years ago for violating the Voting Rights Act will now be protected as long as the state frames its defense entirely around party politics.
It fundamentally alters the strategy of every redistricting committee in the country moving forward. So what does this all mean for you? The overarching takeaway from everything we've looked at today is that the battle for control of Congress isn't just happening at the ballot box in November.
No, the real fight is being fought right now in map rooms, state legislatures, and the Supreme Court.
Where you live, how your neighbors vote, and how the courts interpret the rules all dictate the actual power of your single vote. We often think of our vote as a fixed value, like a dollar bill that holds the same worth no matter where we spend it.
But the reality of American geography and our legal system is that the value of your vote fluctuates wildly based on the invisible lines drawn around your house.
Right, and those lines are continuously being manipulated based on the assumptions politicians make about you, simply based on the zip code you chose to live in.
Which leaves us with a pretty intense thought to ponder.
Yeah, what's that?
If our voting power is ultimately determined by our zip code and our lifestyle choices, if the natural sorting of urban versus rural populations is deciding our elections long before a single ballot is even cast, what happens to the health of our democracy if we completely stop living next to people who disagree with us?
Wow. Yeah, if those geographic ice cubes just keep getting more and more concentrated, the maps will only get more extreme. Keep questioning the structures behind the headlines because the game is being played on a board you can barely see. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us today. We'll catch you next time.